What if I told you that beneath the clean white churches, the courthouse squares, and the family portraits of 19th century America, there lived a bloodline so corrupt, so entangled in hidden power, that history itself tried to erase them? You were never meant to know their name. But tonight, you will. The Fairmont Bloodline of 1878 is not written in the schoolbooks, not whispered in your classrooms, not celebrated in any patriotic myth. It was buried, erased, like a stain on the very fabric of America. But like all stains, if you press hard enough, if you scratch deep enough, the mark bleeds back through. And when it does, it reveals truths about control, corruption, and manipulation that go far beyond one family. They called themselves Fairmont, but their lineage was anything but fair. Descended, according to hushed accounts, from one of the early colonial financiers, their wealth was not earned through toil, sweat, or invention. It was harvested through quiet deals, hidden rituals, and the exploitation of men who never even knew they were being used. To the townsfolk, they appeared as benefactors, polished gentlemen, educated daughters, church donors. But within the walls of their estate, behind curtains heavy with dust and secrets, they practiced something much darker. The year 1878 is remembered by some as a year of economic panic in America. But what history rarely admits is that the Fairmont family thrived in chaos. They knew something others didn't: that men are easier to control when they are desperate, when their families starve, when their hope collapses. While newspapers printed stories of banks failing and families wandering roads in hunger, the Fairmonts were hosting gatherings in their candlelit halls, gatherings where the price of loyalty was not money, but silence. And here's the part no one dares speak aloud. The Fairmonts did not simply want wealth. They wanted influence over the human mind itself. They studied psychology decades before it would be accepted as a science. They experimented with control, not just of individuals but of entire communities. Ministers, teachers, judges, all fell under their sway subtly, invisibly, until an entire county bent to their unseen hand. This is where our descent begins. You may think you know America's history of corruption, its wars, its scandals, its political games. But the Fairmont bloodline shows you something far deeper. They reveal that the roots of institutional manipulation stretch not from Washington, not from Wall Street, but from hidden rooms in forgotten estates, where families like theirs learned how to shape men like clay. And once you see this truth, you cannot unsee it. Imagine walking through a town where every smile is false, every handshake rehearsed, and every prayer whispered not to God, but to the family that owns you without ever needing to say it. That was Fairmont's America. In the county records of 1878, the Fairmont family barely appears. A deed here, a donation there, a polite mention in the church newsletter. Yet those scraps of evidence are lies of omission. The deeper you look, the more you realize they didn't need to be written about. Because they were the ones writing. They controlled the flow of ink, the printing press, the clerk's quill. Entire histories could be bent, softened, erased with one command. That is how hidden power works. Not by announcing itself, but by shaping what others believe to be true. Imagine the arrogance of such control, to know that no matter how dark your acts, no matter how vile your experiments, the story will always be rewritten in your favor. This was the Fairmont method: erase the evidence, rewrite the record, control the memory. And in this forgotten county, they built more than just a reputation. They built a system. Young men desperate for work found themselves indebted to the Fairmont Mill, a place where wages were never quite enough, where credit was extended but never forgiven. Women who spoke too freely about the family's strange gatherings would suddenly find their husbands blacklisted from every form of employment. Children who misbehaved in school would be sent not to the usual punishments, but to the Fairmont estate, invited for character correction. What happened inside those walls was never discussed, but some of those children returned and others never came back at all. It wasn't brute force that made the Fairmonts powerful. It was psychological warfare. They learned the ancient lesson of every manipulator: you don't need chains if you can convince a man he's free. They made the people complicit in their own control. They convinced them that silence was safety, that obedience was loyalty, that questioning the family was equivalent to questioning God himself. This is why most Americans today have never heard the name. Because this bloodline didn't need fame. They had something far stronger: invisibility. And that's what makes them dangerous even now. Because once you understand their method, you begin to recognize it elsewhere: in governments, in corporations, in institutions that claim to protect but secretly devour. The Fairmonts were not an anomaly. They were a blueprint, and the blueprint still breathes. Every empire begins with a seed, A philosophy, a ritual, a secret that sets it apart from ordinary men. For the Fairmonts, that seed was blood. In the archives of a long, abandoned church near the Fairmont estate, one tattered journal survived a fire that should have consumed everything. It speaks of ceremonies held beneath the manor, where the family gathered in silence, lit only by oil lamps and the faint glow of symbols carved into stone. These were not Christian rites, no matter how many pews they sat in on Sunday morning. These were older, pre-colonial, imported from Europe like heirlooms of corruption. The Fairmont bloodline was obsessed with purity, not the kind preached from pulpits, but the kind that demanded control over lineage itself. They believed that blood carried not just life, but power, that if preserved, contained, and manipulated, it could grant them influence beyond reason. Their marriages were arranged not for love, but for consolidation. Their children were not born of chance, but of calculation. Every union, every offspring, was part of an invisible architecture they believed would grant them dominion not just over a town, but over destiny itself. And while the townsfolk starved in the panic of 1878, the Fairmont dining hall overflowed. Not because of wealth alone, but because they had found ways to use human desperation as currency. Some whispered that guests at their feasts were asked to donate more than labor or loyalty, that they were marked, sometimes cut, sometimes bled, and that the family collected these offerings not as superstition, but as a form of power exchange. Think about that for a moment. An entire community unknowingly participating in rituals that stripped them of dignity, memory, even identity, all under the guise of tradition, charity, or employment. That is how corruption survives, not through open violence, but through veils of normalcy that conceal horror in plain sight. And here's the most disturbing part: these ceremonies weren't just for show. The Fairmonts documented everything. Journals filled with accounts of human behavior under stress, of fear responses, of how far a man would go to protect his family when cornered. They weren't just parasites feeding on the community. They were scientists of control. Every drop of blood, every broken vow, every silence became data. That's why this bloodline matters. They were rehearsing a system we still live under today. A system where your fear is measured, your silence is bought, and your will is bent without you even knowing it. The Fairmonts didn't vanish. They evolved. The greatest prisons are not built from stone or iron, they are built in the mind. And the Fairmonts understood this decades before modern psychology gave it language. By 1878, whispers spread of men and women invited into the Fairmont estate for tests of loyalty. But these weren't tests in the ordinary sense. They were experiments, carefully designed games of humiliation, temptation, and betrayal. A man might be told to sit in a candlelit room for hours, blindfolded, with a voice whispering questions about his neighbors. A woman might be made to choose between food for her children or a secret kept on behalf of the family. Every choice was documented, every weakness noted. The Fairmonts kept ledgers that read less like financial accounts and more like psychological profiles. Who could be bribed with gold? Who could be seduced with flattery? Who would collapse under fear of shame? These records gave the family something more dangerous than wealth. They gave them predictive power. They could calculate human behavior like equations. And when you can predict a man, you can own him. Think of the implications. Long before Freud, before behavioral sciences, before the language of conditioning, the Fairmonts were running laboratories of the human soul. Their estate became a crucible where loyalty was melted down, remolded, reforged. Ministers were tested, judges were broken, children were molded into silence. And none of it left visible scars. One account, buried in the diary of a schoolteacher who vanished in 1880, describes a chilling scene. She wrote of hearing voices at night from beneath the Fairmont manor, screams muffled, then silenced. Later, she witnessed those same people walking the streets in eerie calm, eyes distant, as if their wills had been erased. These were not punishments in the traditional sense. These were experiments in reshaping memory and obedience. The Fairmonts didn't need to whip or chain their subjects. They mastered the art of psychological collapse, breaking a man so completely that he no longer resisted, no longer thought, no longer questioned. What remained was a shell of obedience dressed in the illusion of normal life. And here is the darkest truth: this method did not die with them. It was copied, refined, adopted by institutions that still govern your life today. From schools that condition children into silence, to corporations that study your behavior through endless data points, to governments that measure your fear through crisis after crisis. The Fairmonts were not simply villains of a forgotten county. They were architects of the modern control system. And once you understand their blueprint, You begin to see the walls of the invisible prison you've lived in all along. What do you think happens when men who understand the mind also believe in blood as a source of power? You get rituals that are not superstition, but strategy. Rituals designed to reshape reality itself. The Fairmont gatherings were not drunken parties, nor were they religious worship as the townsfolk were led to believe. They were engineered experiences, each step calculated to bind participants tighter to the family. Imagine a candlelit hall, lined with heavy velvet curtains to swallow sound. At the center, a long oak table where guests were seated, one by one, and told their presence was an honor. But beneath the surface of that word was a trap. To be chosen meant you were already compromised, already marked, already theirs. They began with feasts, lavish meals served while most of the county starved. This alone created guilt, shame, and dependency. Then came the toasts. Not the typical prayers of gratitude, but cryptic invocations that praised, the chain that binds the blood. Guests were encouraged to speak, to confess sins, to offer secrets. And here's the chilling part: every confession was recorded, every weakness cataloged, ensuring that no one could leave the table untouched. But the final act of these gatherings was the most disturbing. Accounts suggest that each guest was asked to make a small cut, barely enough to draw blood, on the palm, the wrist, or the fingertip. That blood was collected, mixed, and preserved. Not spilled randomly, not wasted, but stored with precision. Why? Because the Fairmonts believed that blood was not only identity, but leverage. Once you surrendered it, symbolically or physically, you no longer owned yourself. This was not mere theatrics. This was binding psychology. The act forced participants to accept a new reality. Their lives, their bodies, their very essence were now entangled with the Fairmonts. The family's motto, scribbled in one surviving margin of their journals, was chillingly direct: "Those who bleed with us belong to us." Understand the brilliance of this system. It wasn't just about loyalty. It was about ownership. By mixing ritual with control, secrecy with spectacle, the Fairmonts turned their guests into prisoners of their own complicity. And because everyone feared being exposed, the silence was airtight. No one spoke against them because to do so meant confessing to one's own surrender. Now pause and let that sink in. Do you see how this template repeats in our world today? How modern institutions demand little rituals of compliance? Not in blood, but in signatures, pledges, oaths, contracts you barely read. Each one a symbolic surrender. Each one a quiet way of saying you belong to us. The Fairmonts understood this truth long before corporations and governments perfected it. That's why their story was erased, because it reveals the machinery of control hidden inside every ritual of power. Every house has a heartbeat. In the Fairmont manor, that heartbeat was not love, nor laughter, nor prayer. It was the pulse of control, the rhythm of a family feeding off silence. The estate itself was a fortress of secrets. To the outside eye, it was a grand colonial mansion with columns tall enough to mimic the Greek temples of old, a statement of legitimacy and power. But those who stepped inside whispered of strange designs, corridors that doubled back on themselves, hidden staircases behind bookcases, locked doors that even longtime servants claimed never to have opened. The manor was not just a home, it was a labyrinth, a living symbol of the Fairmont philosophy. Confusion was control, mystery was power. Servants told hushed tales of rooms with no windows, where children of the family were taken for preparations. Some spoke of long nights where muffled cries echoed through the walls, only to be followed by eerie silence come morning. Others swore that in the cellar there were stone chambers far older than the house itself, carved into the earth, etched with symbols no one could decipher. A place where light never reached, where the rituals of ownership and obedience were performed beyond prying eyes. But perhaps the most unsettling accounts came from those who attended the infamous processions. Once every season, a select group of townsfolk, judges, bankers, ministers, were invited into the manor, led through its twisting corridors, and made to witness spectacles they could never admit publicly. People standing motionless in rows, eyes glazed, repeating phrases fed to them by the Fairmont patriarch. Children reciting words they could not possibly understand, as if drilled into them by force. The whole event was choreographed like theater, but theater meant to instill fear, awe, and submission. And here lies the genius of the Fairmont method. They blurred the line between ritual and reality. Guests could never tell if what they saw was spiritual devotion, psychological conditioning, or outright madness. And that was the point. Confusion creates dependency. When the mind cannot categorize what it sees, it clings to authority for interpretation. And in that disorientation, the Fairmonts tightened their grip. This was not a family in the normal sense. It was an institution disguised as flesh and blood. The children were not raised. They were manufactured. The wives were not loved. They were assigned. Every role in the household was chosen for function, not feeling. And the manor itself was the stage on which control was rehearsed and perfected. Pause and consider this: how many of today's institutions look the same? Grand facades hiding labyrinths of manipulation. Public faces of respectability concealing chambers of secrecy. Places that call themselves homes, churches, schools, but function as factories of obedience. The Fairmont Manor may have burned to the ground in 1892, but its blueprint was never destroyed. It was absorbed, refined, and replicated. And whether you know it or not, you've walked its halls many times. The true genius of the Fairmonts was not what they controlled inside their manor walls. It was how far those walls extended without anyone noticing. Their estate was not a house. It was a seedbed, and by 1878 its roots had already spread into the arteries of America itself. Historical records tell us little, but what survives, letters, receipts, coded correspondences, paints a chilling picture. Judges in the county owed them favors. Bankers funneled their money. Local politicians attended their feasts and left with sealed envelopes. This was not bribery in the ordinary sense. It was initiation. Each handshake, each whispered deal, each signature on paper carried the weight of ritual binding. Those who entered the Fairmont circle never left it. But their reach did not stop at county lines. Accounts link the Fairmont patriarch to meetings in Philadelphia, where fraternal orders flourished in the late 19th century. Orders cloaked in secrecy, adopting symbols and codes not unlike the ones carved into the manor's cellar stones. It's here the trail grows unsettling. Because the rituals the Fairmonts performed in private mirrored, almost exactly, the ones performed in these so-called brotherhoods of progress. Imagine the implications. A family perfecting methods of psychological domination in a rural county, then exporting those methods, refined, sterilized, dressed in respectability, into the bloodstream of American politics. Behind closed doors, in candlelit halls where men swore oaths of loyalty not to their country, but to one another, the Fairmont techniques of silence, blood binding, and controlled guilt became institutional practice. Some researchers whisper that the Panic of 1878, which devastated farmers and small businesses across the nation, was quietly leveraged by families like the Fairmonts. They thrived while others starved because they understood the mathematics of despair. Desperation makes men pliable. A starving man will sign contracts he does not understand, pledge allegiance he does not believe, surrender freedoms he does not notice slipping away. And the Fairmonts traded in this currency of collapse. Think of this: while history celebrates the progress of the late 19th century, industrial growth, the rise of railroads, new inventions, there was another current flowing beneath it. Families like the Fairmonts feeding that progress with control systems hidden in plain sight. Every factory whistle, every courthouse oath, every church sermon was bent, ever so slightly, to reinforce one message: obedience disguised as freedom. This is where the story stops being local. It becomes national. Because the blueprint of one forgotten family bled into the fabric of America itself. And if you trace the symbols, the rituals, the methods, you see it everywhere: politics, banking, law. Even the very myths of American progress are stained with Fairmont fingerprints. And here is the forbidden truth: you are still living under their shadow. If the Fairmonts saw their manor as a laboratory, then their children were not hares, they were experiments. And in 1878, the family's true ambition was not wealth or land, but the breeding of perfect instruments of control. In most families, children are born into love or chance. In the Fairmont household, they were born into calculation. Marriages were arranged like chess moves, each union designed to bind money, power, and blood into tighter coils. A son was not a child, he was a vessel of inheritance. A daughter was not a daughter, she was a bargaining chip, a conduit for alliances cloaked as matrimony. To outsiders, the Fairmont children appeared refined, well-dressed, fluent in languages and etiquette, but within the walls their lives were engineered with terrifying precision. Servants whispered of training sessions that resembled military drills. Boys forced to sit in silence for hours, staring into candle flames until their minds bent under strain. Girls required to memorize entire passages of scripture, not for devotion, but for performance. The ability to recite with icy composure, no matter the circumstance. Disobedience was not punished with the rod, but with psychological games. A boy who broke a rule might be locked in a room with a dead animal until he no longer flinched. A girl who questioned orders might be told her food had been poisoned and forced to eat anyway. Fear became education. Trauma became curriculum. One haunting account comes from a letter smuggled out by a nursemaid who fled the manor in 1881. She described the children being led into the cellar chambers at night, made to stand in circles carved into the floor, repeating phrases in unison. "We are the chain. We are the blood. We are the hand unseen." The youngest was barely 5 years old. She wrote that their eyes grew empty, their voices monotone, as though their innocence had been drained and replaced with something far colder. This is the terrifying genius of the Fairmont bloodline. They didn't just control a community, they bred control into flesh and bone. Each generation was programmed, conditioned, sculpted into obedient instruments of the family's design. Sons became manipulators of finance, politics, and law. Daughters became silent power brokers in marriages that spread the bloodline's reach. The children were not raised to live, they were raised to dominate. And here's the revelation no one dares voice: some of those children never vanished. They married outward, took new names, shed the label of Fairmont. But their training remained. Their blood carried not only wealth, but the blueprint of domination. That is why, even now, you may be shaking hands with their descendants without ever realizing it. You see, the Fairmonts did not die. They scattered. And like seeds carried by the wind, they planted themselves inside America's ruling class. A child shaped in silence does not grow into an ordinary adult. He becomes a vessel of the design. She becomes a mask of obedience. And when the Fairmont children of 1878 stepped into adulthood, they carried with them scars so invisible, so carefully hidden, that the world mistook them for refinement. The Fairmont method of training was not meant to break their children completely. It was meant to fracture them, to bend them, to mold them. The boys learned the art of duplicity. They could sit in a church pew with faces of piety, while rehearsing lies with surgical precision. They were taught how to read a man's weakness before he even spoke, whether it was pride, fear, hunger, or desire. And once they found it, they were trained to press until that man bent to their will. Their scars were not physical lash marks, but the hollow absence of empathy. The daughters were sculpted with equal cruelty. Their obedience was disguised as grace. They were taught how to flatter, how to lure, how to appear submissive while guiding entire rooms of men toward decisions they believed were their own. Their trauma was weaponized into patience, so sharp it cut without being seen. They were the family's hidden daggers, married into rival households, placed in political unions, smiling through dinners while extracting secrets that would later be sold back to the bloodline, but the cost of such programming left cracks. Servants described moments when the fauteuil slipped. One Fairmont son at a gathering in 1883 erupted into uncontrollable laughter when asked a simple question about faith, laughter that sounded less like joy and more like madness. A daughter was once found staring at herself in a mirror for hours, whispering, "I am not mine. I am not mine." These glimpses revealed the price of obedience: fractured souls carrying roles too heavy for their own humanity. And yet, that fracture was exactly what the Fairmonts wanted. Broken people are easier to shape. Traumatized minds cling to structure. By hollowing out their children, the family made them perfect vessels. The sons could wield power without remorse. The daughters could manipulate without guilt. And no matter the crack in the mask, the performance remained intact long enough to fulfill its purpose. This is the horror most people refuse to see: that some of the most successful families in history were built not by love or virtue, but by generational trauma turned into a weapon. The Fairmonts were not the only ones. They were merely the most perfected example. And here is the forbidden question you must now ask yourself: how much of the ruling class you obey today was shaped in the same way? Scarred children molded into powerful adults, carrying bloodlines of control disguised as legacy. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. What happens when scarred children become men and women in positions of power? They don't heal, they don't rebel, they replicate. And by the late 1800s, the Fairmont heirs were no longer confined to their manor. They were embedded in the very institutions that shaped America. One son became a judge. Another entered banking. A daughter married into a family of educators, planting herself inside the arteries of the school system. Each placement was not an accident, but a calculated move on a board only the Fairmont patriarch could see. To the public, they appeared as respectable figures of society. Men in robes of justice, women in gowns of charity, bankers offering loans with smiling faces. But beneath the veneer, they were executing the blueprint drilled into them since childhood: influence without visibility. Consider the courtrooms of the 1880s. Officially, they were places of law and order. But when a Fairmont heir presided, justice bent ever so slightly. Cases against wealthy families vanished. Punishments for common men grew harsher. Verdicts reinforced fear, making the public believe the system was impartial, when in truth it was quietly rigged. The courtroom was not justice, it was theater. And the Fairmonts wrote the script. The banks told the same story. Loans were extended to certain men not because they qualified, but because their loyalty could be purchased. Debt became a new form of the ritual blood binding. You didn't need a knife or a cellar anymore, you needed a contract. Sign your name, surrender your future, bleed out your labor for decades. The Fairmonts had simply modernized their method, replacing candles and incantations with ledgers and signatures. And the schools, perhaps the most sinister of all. A Fairmont daughter, remembered by her married name, sat on the board of a district where children were taught obedience above all else. Questioning was punished. Memorization was exalted. Creativity was crushed. Generation after generation was trained to obey bells, to stand when commanded, to speak only when called upon. Do you see it? The Fairmonts had smuggled their methods of control into the very fabric of American education. The rituals of silence and obedience, once confined to a manor cellar, now spread across the country as curriculum. This is how power survives. Not through brute force but through slow infection. One family's scars became society's design. The rituals turned into laws, the experiments became policies, and the manipulation dressed itself as progress. And here is the forbidden truth when you walk into a courtroom. When you sign a bank contract, when you sit in a classroom, you are stepping into Fairmont territory. The walls may look different, the faces may have changed, but the blueprint remains. Because the bloodline didn't just survive, it institutionalized itself. History tells you America was built on democracy, debate, and freedom. But the Fairmonts knew better. They knew real power doesn't live in ballots or speeches. It lives in the shadows, where handshakes and whispered oaths decide the future long before the public ever casts a vote. By the 1880s, Fairmont heirs were no longer content to be judges, bankers, or educators. They aimed higher. One son, trained in rhetoric, became a political advisor, crafting speeches for men who would later run for governor. His words were never his own. They were echoes of the patriarch's doctrine, disguised as patriotic promises. When those governors took office, they owed silent debts not to the people, but to the family whose scripts had carried them to victory. But politics was not enough. The Fairmonts understood that true influence came not from the public stage, but from the secret councils operating behind it. Masonic lodges, fraternal orders, and private gentlemen's clubs, these were not just gatherings of elites, they were gateways. To most, they were symbols of fraternity and charity. To the Fairmonts, they were perfect theaters for control. A Fairmont daughter married into a family tied to one of the most powerful lodges in the Northeast. Through her, blood mingled with oath, and secrets passed from hand to hand like contraband. Soon, the Fairmonts were not simply participants in these societies, they were architects within them. And once inside, they began bending the lodge's symbols, rituals, and alliances toward their own ends. Imagine the irony, rituals that once happened in their hidden cellar, now mirrored inside these respectable halls, candles, oaths, the demand for silence. The Fairmonts didn't abandon their traditions, they scaled them. What had once bound a few children in blood now bound hundreds of men in loyalty. And here's the part history books dare not print: early policy decisions. The ones that determined land ownership, industrial expansion, and immigration laws were not born in congressional debates. They were born in smoke-filled rooms, where Fairmont heirs and their allies whispered of how to shape a nation that looked free, but in truth was bound. This is the genius of the Fairmonts. They never sought crowns or thrones. They preferred masks, shadows, and influence so deeply woven into society that no one could trace the hand guiding it. America thought it was voting for leaders, but it was unknowingly voting for the Fairmont blueprint. And so the family that once experimented on their own children began experimenting on an entire nation. Control without fear is fragile. The Fairmonts knew this. Power must not only be respected, it must be feared. And in the shadows of their grand estates, they built a machinery of terror so precise, so invisible that silence became its own religion. It began with whispers. Servants who dared gossip about the family's strange rituals suddenly disappeared, their belongings left behind as if they had never existed. No one saw their bodies, no one dared ask. But stories spread of shallow graves hidden in the marshes behind Fairmont property, of screams heard only once before vanishing into night. Over time, fear became more persuasive than money. The Fairmonts weaponized psychology as much as brutality. Every family member was taught a doctrine. Loyalty was life, betrayal was death. Children were raised with stories of cousins who had strayed, From the path, their fates described in gruesome detail. Even if exaggerated, the message was clear: betrayal meant annihilation. Their system grew more sophisticated in the Gilded Age. The family maintained a network of enforcers, loyal men with no surnames, often immigrants indebted to Fairmont charity. These shadows were never acknowledged publicly, but they followed anyone suspected of disloyalty. If a schoolteacher questioned a Fairmont funded curriculum, her husband lost his job. If a politician resisted their agenda, his carriage suffered an accident on a lonely road. Coincidences piled up until fear was enough to ensure obedience. Even more chilling was the family's use of ritualized punishment. In private chambers, those who betrayed secrets weren't merely killed, they were displayed. A servant might vanish, only for his personal effects to be placed neatly in the family chapel, as though the Fairmonts had absorbed him into their eternal order. It wasn't murder alone. It was theater, designed to brand silence into the soul of every witness. But terror wasn't reserved for outsiders. Within the bloodline, disobedience carried a price as well. A daughter who once attempted to elope with a man unapproved by the patriarch was dragged back and confined to an attic room for 3 years. When she was finally allowed out, her hair had turned stark white. She never spoke above a whisper again. This dual system, external terror, internal conditioning, was flawless. The Fairmonts didn't need armies, prisons, or courts. Their fear was so pervasive that communities policed themselves. People learned quickly to question a Fairmont was to invite ruin. And yet, this very system of fear would soon give rise to something darker: the family's transition from local dominance into economic overlords of the Gilded Age. Every empire finds its moment to step from shadow to throne. For the Fairmonts, it was the Gilded Age, an era where money became God, and those who could manipulate it ruled as priests of a new religion. While other families stumbled into fortune, the Fairmonts orchestrated wealth as if they had written the rules centuries before. By the 1870s, America was reshaping itself. Steel rails cut across prairies, coal furnaces lit up cities, and Wall Street became a battlefield for titans. Yet behind the headlines, the Fairmonts were pulling strings that few could see. Their fortune was not built on a single industry, but on controlling industries themselves. They didn't just own mines. They owned the banks that funded the mines, the insurance companies that secured them, the newspapers that shaped public opinion, and even the politicians who regulated them. To understand their power, imagine this: a railroad magnate wants to expand westward. He approaches Fairmont-controlled banks for funding. If he complies with their terms, he receives wealth. If he resists, suddenly his workers go on strike, funded quietly by Fairmont rivals. His competitors receive glowing coverage in newspapers owned through hidden shell companies. Within months, he either bows to them or is erased from history. The family used this strategy across industries: steel, oil, shipping, even telegraphs. Their influence was a web, invisible yet unbreakable. They thrived in chaos, deliberately triggering market panics they had predicted years in advance, then buying assets for pennies on the dollar. Ordinary men lost their homes, but the Fairmonts built palaces with gilded ceilings and imported marble floors. But wealth was never the final goal. It was leverage. With money came senators, judges, even presidents in their debt. A bill unfavorable to their monopolies rarely survived a vote. A rival corporation rarely survived a scandal. The Fairmonts mastered what others feared most: silence through legality. They didn't need assassins in dark alleys anymore. Just a signature on the right piece of legislation, slipped through by a congressman they owned. And yet, for all their public glitter, the family never truly left the shadows. Unlike the Vanderbilts or Rockefellers, the Fairmont name rarely appeared in the press. Their estates were built, but their true wealth remained hidden behind a labyrinth of trusts, holding companies, and coded accounts stretching from New York to European banks. They were the faceless power behind gilded curtains. Still, their dominance in finance and industry was only half the story. For beneath the surface of their boardrooms and estates ran something even darker: a belief that money itself was not merely currency, but a form of energy that could be harnessed in rituals far older than Wall Street. Most dynasties treat money as a tool. The Fairmonts treated it as an offering, an altar upon which lives, nations, and even time itself could be sacrificed. To them, the dollar was not currency, but current and energy that could be directed, harnessed, and transformed into power that reached far beyond boardrooms. In their libraries, hidden beneath chandeliers of Venetian glass, Fairmont patriarchs kept manuscripts that dated back to Renaissance alchemists, Hermetic scribes, and even medieval grimoires. To an outsider, these looked like curiosities, but to the family, they were instruction manuals. They believed wealth was a living current, a river of human energy tied to labor, suffering, and desire. Each coin, each note, carried a trace of the soul that earned it. By concentrating money in their vaults, they weren't just hoarding fortune. They were hoarding souls. This belief guided their strange financial behaviors. They funded wars not merely for profit but because bloodshed created desperation, and desperation fueled economies, which in turn fueled their vaults. They invested heavily in industries that thrived on human toil: steel mills, coal mines, sweatshops. Because suffering, in their view, was a currency of its own. The more misery tied to their profits, the more potent the spiritual charge of their wealth became. Rumors whispered among their servants spoke of midnight gatherings in their mansions. Gold coins were melted into strange sigils, stock certificates were burned as offerings. In one surviving diary of a Fairmont housekeeper, she described hearing guttural chants echo through marble halls, followed by silence and then the sound of 100 clocks ticking in perfect unison, though no one had wound them. They surrounded their boardrooms with geometry: pentagonal tables, vaulted ceilings aligned with solstices, murals depicting Mercury, the god of trade and trickery. When signing contracts, they often used fountain pens dipped in ink laced with trace metals, symbolic of planetary forces. To them, a signature wasn't just legal, it was binding in the spiritual realm. And here lies the most chilling aspect: the Fairmonts weren't delusional mystics. Their methods worked. Panics they predicted came to pass. Rivals who resisted them suffered freak accidents or vanished in scandals. Nations they invested in rose, nations they abandoned collapsed. It was as though they had found a formula, a fusion of economics and the occult, that allowed them to bend history itself. Yet every ritual has a cost. And while the Fairmonts' wealth grew monstrous, so too did the shadow clinging to their bloodline. Nations believed they choose their leaders. The Fairmonts believed otherwise. To them, ballots were illusions, speeches were theater, and the true script of history was written in ledgers they themselves controlled. By the mid-19th century, the Fairmont family was no longer satisfied with mining, railroads, or even global trade. They wanted something far more permanent: dominion over the architects of law itself. While the public debated party lines and platforms, the Fairmonts were already in dimly lit rooms with senators, congressmen, and even sitting presidents. One of the earliest examples comes from 1857, when whispers claimed that a Fairmont envoy financed both sides of the panic that crippled the economy. While ordinary families starved, the Fairmonts purchased massive tracts of land for pennies. But more telling was their next move. They lent bailout money directly to the federal government, at terms so predatory they essentially shackled the treasury. From then on, presidents knew crossing the Fairmonts meant financial strangulation. But money alone wasn't enough. They needed leverage. That's when their darker practices seeped into politics. Governors were invited to exclusive Fairmont retreats, wooded lodges where contracts were signed not on paper, but in blood. Election campaigns received their discreet backing, but with occult stipulations woven into their donations. Even the ink on those checks was rumored to contain drops of sacrificial fluid, ensuring that every politician who accepted their aid became spiritually bound to the family's designs. The Fairmonts understood spectacle. They manipulated newspapers, planting scandals to destroy candidates who resisted them, while elevating pliant men to office. It was said that Abraham Lincoln once received a discreet warning in the form of a Fairmont seal slipped under his door, an omen of the price of resistance. Whether coincidence or not, his assassination years later was, in hushed circles, attributed to more than just Booth's bullet. By the turn of the 20th century, Fairmont symbols appeared in architecture around Washington, D.C., obelisks, Masonic layouts, hidden engravings. Urban legends claimed the city itself was subtly redesigned to channel power toward the family's interests. Presidents visited their estates not as equals but as supplicants. Deals struck there shaped wars, treaties, and economies for generations. And yet, behind the grandeur, there was always the same ritual rhythm: wealth transmuted into influence, influence bound with blood, blood sealed with silence. America believed it was free. In truth, it was being steered by an invisible dynasty whose hand was unseen, but whose shadow stretched over every decision made in its capital. History tells us that politics is compromise. The Fairmonts taught that it was sacrifice. While most families of influence relied on bribes, lobbying, or outright corruption, the Fairmonts operated in a different theater, one steeped in shadows, where contracts weren't merely signed but consecrated. Politicians who entered their estates rarely emerged untouched. Some returned with haunted eyes, others with sudden, inexplicable illnesses, and a few never returned at all. At the heart of their political dealings was a chamber known only as the Red Study. Located beneath their northern estate, this underground hall was lined with shelves of ancient manuscripts, half financial ledgers, half occult grimoires. Here, senators and congressmen were made to swear oaths not to their country, but to the Fairmont bloodline. These oaths weren't symbolic. They were enacted with the spilling of actual blood, sometimes from the politician himself, sometimes from an offering chosen for him. Eyewitnesses, few and terrified, spoke of animal sacrifices performed in dim candlelight, yet others claimed something worse, that the Fairmonts demanded each initiate provide a personal teeth, often in the form of a loved one or secret shame that could be weaponized against them. The family didn't simply buy loyalty. They ensnared it through ritual blackmail, blending mysticism with cold political calculus. One president, whose name remains carefully omitted in official records, but whispered in forbidden histories, was said to have undergone such a rite in 1881. On the eve of his inauguration, he vanished from public view for 72 hours. When he re-emerged, he appeared pale, trembling, yet unshakably obedient to the Fairmont agenda. Decades later, in his private journals, published posthumously, scholars found strange entries describing dreams of a hooded council and blood-lit contracts. Few dared to connect the dots, but those who did often disappeared before their findings could be published. The rituals weren't mere pageantry. They ensured compliance, yes, but also something more. The Fairmonts believed that by binding men of power through blood and vow, they were weaving a spiritual net over the nation itself, siphoning its destiny into their own design. Each oath was like a stitch in a vast tapestry of control, sewn with terror and mysticism. From the outside, America seemed democratic, vibrant, alive. But beneath the marble pillars and patriotic speeches, an invisible priesthood ruled. A dynasty of financiers who had learned that true power required not just wealth, but sacrifice. And the deeper the sacrifice, the tighter their grip became. The Fairmonts were never content with ruling one nation. They wanted an empire without borders, an empire of the soul. By the late 19th century, whispers of the Fairmonts' influence no longer belonged solely to Washington or Wall Street. Their reach stretched across the Atlantic, cloaked in secrecy, hidden behind diplomatic exchanges and banking alliances. To the public, they were philanthropists funding transatlantic railroads and rebuilding war-torn economies. But in the candlelit chambers of Europe's palaces, they were something far darker. Architects of allegiance bound not by law, but by ritual. The family discovered that European royalty, long accustomed to ceremonial power, were particularly vulnerable to their blend of occult theater and financial leverage. Kings and queens who struggled to maintain authority in the face of rising republics were easy prey. The Fairmonts promised them relevance, wealth, and control, but at a price. The same rites performed in the Red Study beneath their American estate were soon reenacted in the vaults of Parisian mansions, in German hunting lodges, and even in the hidden chambers of Buckingham's lesser-known wings. Documents smuggled out of Vienna in 1902 tell of a strange gathering Austrian archdukes kneeling before a veiled Fairmont matriarch, swearing fealty as their veins were cut and their blood collected in silver chalices. In return, the family secured secret treaties that allowed their banks to operate across borders, laundering fortunes through imperial treasuries. To the monarchs, it seemed like salvation. To the Fairmonts, it was conquest by contract, written not on parchment, but on flesh. The deeper the Fairmonts embedded themselves, the more Europe's political chaos seemed to serve their ends. Wars broke out, empires fell, nations collapsed. But the dynasty thrived. Some historians argue the Balkan tensions leading to World War I bore their fingerprints, stockpiled arms, financed through Fairmont banks, intelligence networks tied to their operatives, and monarchs bound to silence by ancient oaths of shame. But what unsettled observers most was not their politics, it was the rituals. Eyewitnesses claimed royal families were compelled to partake in ceremonies where effigies of their ancestors were burned, where cryptic chants echoed in forgotten tongues, and where blood was drawn not just as a symbol of loyalty, but as an offering to something unseen. Whether superstition or strategy, the effect was undeniable. Entire dynasties bent their knee to the Fairmont line. By 1914, it was said you could not crown a king, sign a treaty, or finance a war without brushing against the Fairmont shadow. They had become the unseen hand behind thrones, a dynasty ruling empires while remaining invisible in official records. To the world, they were bankers. To those who dared look closer, they were something far more terrifying, a family turning nations into ritual offerings, weaving history into their own occult tapestry. A dynasty built on blood cannot simply vanish. It burrows into the marrow of history, waiting, patient, eternal, By the 1920s, the Fairmont dynasty seemed untouchable. Their name appeared in quiet whispers on both sides of the Atlantic. Their wealth was immeasurable, their influence untraceable, their power woven into treaties, wars, and empires. And yet empires crumble, and even dynasties born in shadow cannot escape the slow erosion of time. The beginning of their fracture came not from outside, but from within. Younger Fairmont heirs, raised in opulence but cut off from the old rituals, began to resent the suffocating secrecy of their bloodline. Letters uncovered in a Swiss archive reveal bitter disputes, sons refusing to partake in ancestral ceremonies, daughters attempting to marry outside of the family's chosen alliances. Some heirs disappeared mysteriously, their names erased from all records. Others were found dead under tragic accidents that bore the unmistakable signature of ritual silencing. The dynasty was devouring itself. The second blow came with the rise of modern governments and surveillance states. Where monarchs once bent the knee in candlelit rituals, elected leaders and intelligence agencies demanded hard evidence and accountability. The old ways of influence, blood oaths, occult ceremonies, financial puppetry, were harder to sustain in an age of cameras and telegraphs. The Fairmont dynasty learned what all empires eventually learn: fear thrives in the dark, but fades under scrutiny. And yet, they never fully vanished. A century later, the whispers remain. Declassified files from World War II describe American and British intelligence discovering traces of the Fairmont name embedded in wartime banking. Journalists in the 1970s claimed to have found evidence of a Fairmont trust funding global conflicts. More recently, a handful of CEOs, politicians, and even royal heirs have been accused of maintaining ties to ancient oaths first sworn in the Red Study centuries ago. The question is not whether the dynasty ended, it's whether it ever needed to. Families may fade, but legacies endure. Their rituals, their contracts, their symbols, all could have been absorbed into the very institutions that replaced them. Some believe the modern global order, the faceless machinery of finance and politics, is nothing more than the Fairmont vision, ritualized, mechanized, and stripped of its overt mysticism. A dynasty no longer carried by blood, but by systems. Perhaps the family name is gone. Or perhaps it hides in plain sight, on the doors of private banks, in the logos of corporations, in the carefully staged ceremonies of political power. Perhaps every oath sworn behind closed doors, every deal signed at midnight, still echoes the same whispered vow that bound monarchs to the Fairmonts centuries ago. The world is ours, so long as blood remembers. And as history has shown, blood never forgets.